Genetics. In this video, we'll tackle the question, why do organisms look and act the way they do? For example, why do humans all look slightly different, but also very similar? Why do we act different? Or why are there like a million types of dogs? All the dogs are the same species, however they look different and they act different. To help understand those questions, we're going to have to dive into genetics. First, it's really important to know that inside each and every cell of an organism is DNA. You, for example, are made of roughly 3 trillion cells, and inside every one of your cells is DNA. And more important than that, the DNA in every one of your cells is exactly the same. Now, to keep going, we have to talk about some vocabulary. First up, DNA contains all of the genetic information of an organism. DNA is really just information. Your body and your cells can use that information to build things. Now, DNA is a really long molecule, so to fit it inside a cell, DNA is stored in chromosomes. Chromosomes are just large structures of DNA, and on those chromosomes are genes. Genes are the small sections of DNA that actually code for proteins. And proteins are molecules created by cells that determine the organism's traits. Finally, traits are observable characteristics, things like eye color, hair color, height, speed. So they are the observable characteristics of an organism. So again, top to bottom, DNA is all of the genetic information that is packed into chromosomes. On the chromosomes are genes. The genes code information to make proteins, and when organism cells make proteins, that can determine traits. Again, the interesting thing here is that inside every cell is a nucleus. And in the nucleus is the DNA packed up into chromosomes. But the DNA of every cell in your body is exactly the same. So the DNA in muscle cells and digestive cells, retina cells, skin cells, and neurons, all of that information is exactly the same. Which begs the question, how is it possible that using the same DNA, our bodies can make so many different types of cells and have so many different traits? To help understand, I like to think of restaurants. And let's take a bakery, for instance. So how does a bakery create all of these wonderful treats, these observable characteristics, these things that we can see? Well, if we're thinking of a bakery as a cell, well then inside every bakery is going to be a bookshelf full of cookbooks. And there's cookbooks for all sorts of different recipes. But since this is a bakery, the bakers would only pull the cookbooks for things like cakes and cookies. And inside of those cookbooks would be individual recipes that the bakers could make, and those recipes could be used to make the cakes and cookies that we see on display. Now that's the same thing that's happening inside of an organism. Let's take this dog for instance. Inside every cell of the dog, there's DNA. And that DNA is packed up onto chromosomes, kind of like the cookbooks in the bakery. On the chromosomes are different genes. Those are like the recipes. And those genes code for different proteins. That would be like the cookies and the cakes that the bakery made. Now, those proteins are what determine the characteristics of the dog. Things like its eye color, or the type of ear it has, or its fur color, or that really cute curly tail. All of those characteristics are determined by the proteins that were made. And the proteins were determined by the genes. The genes were on the chromosomes, and the chromosomes were in the cell. It's also important to know that organisms have unique DNA. You and I are very similar in terms of DNA, but there are small differences that make you look like you and me look like me. But all organisms on Earth share a certain amount of DNA. For example, humans and chimpanzees were 96% compatible. Our DNA is 96% the same. And even things as far away seeming as a banana, we share 60% similarities with our DNA and the DNA of a banana. Now, those small differences can be seen in this example. Here we have a dog, and we're looking at its cells, so we're seeing what's inside the dog, and we'll see how that affects what's on the outside, the observable characteristics of the dog. So inside each of the dog cells is a nucleus filled with chromosomes that are DNA. And on that DNA is perhaps a gene for a protein that creates pointy ears. And on that chromosome, there's probably a gene for the protein that creates blue eyes. So again, the genes are determining proteins, and the proteins determine the characteristics we can see on the outside. Now another dog, same thing. In its cells is a nucleus. The nuclei contain chromosomes, and it has DNA, probably very similar to the last dog. But it has a gene that creates a protein for droopy ears. There's probably a slight difference in that gene. And it has a gene that produces a protein which creates brown eyes. So both dogs have DNA and chromosomes, and they both have genes for things like ears and eyes, but those small differences in the genes create small differences in the proteins, and that changes the characteristics we see on the outside. So here's your key ideas. First, cells contain DNA, and they contain the same DNA for every cell of an organism. Inside those cells, DNA is packaged into chromosomes. On those chromosomes are genes, which are just chunks of DNA, little pieces of information. Each of those genes codes for a protein. Each gene is the information that allows a cell to make a protein. Proteins are molecules that determine traits. The traits are what we can see on the outside. And finally, all organisms have different DNA, which is why all organisms have different traits. That explains why humans look and act slightly differently. We all have different DNA, which means we have different genes, which code for different proteins, which make slightly different traits.